In 2019, something unnerving was discovered. Huberman, piecing together findings that Jung had mapped out way back in 1913. It's a hidden truth about what goes on every single night while you're fast asleep. And no, it's not about the hazy dreams that you barely remember in the morning. It's about a neurological process, one that's actively sabotaging your decisions, your relationships, and your ability to truly become who you're meant to be. And the most terrifying part, you have absolutely, positively no idea it's even happening. While your body is resting, your brain is waging a silent war against yourself. Let me pull back the curtain and show you what modern neuroscience has finally been able to prove about Jung's shadow, and why this single discovery changes everything you thought you knew about who you really are. Back in 2019, neuroimaging studies at Huberman's lab at Stanford University, they stumbled upon something that sent shockwaves through the neuroscience community. It challenged decades of assumed knowledge about how our brains process emotions during sleep. Using high-resolution functional MRI, they observed very specific activation patterns in the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, all during the REM phase of sleep. But here's the detail that completely changed the game. What they observed wasn't just some random processing of emotional memories. It was a highly organized, systematic process of reinforcing and consolidating behavioral patterns that you consciously reject during the day. Your brain was literally practicing and strengthening the exact behaviors you're trying hardest to avoid while you're awake. Jung described this phenomenon way back in 1913, calling it the shadow. Those repressed aspects of our personality that can't find conscious expression, but Jung didn't have access to the technology that could prove the biological mechanism behind it. He clinically observed that patients exhibited nighttime behaviors and morning tendencies that directly contradicted their conscious intentions. He theorized that something in the unconscious was actively working against conscious efforts at change. What he couldn't know was that he was describing with eerie accuracy a real, measurable neurological process that unfolds in specific brain structures during very specific phases of sleep. Here's what really happens every night in your brain. During the initial hours of sleep, your hippocampus begins the memory consolidation process. We all know that, but simultaneously, deep limbic structures, especially the amygdala, they start a different process. They scan the day's memories, searching for moments of cognitive dissonance, those situations where you acted one way but felt another, moments where you suppressed impulses, stifled genuine emotions, or forced behaviors that felt inauthentic. And here's where it gets disturbing. When the amygdala identifies these moments of dissonance, it doesn't discard them. It doesn't let them go. It marks them. It strengthens them. It creates deeper neural connections, linking those repressed impulses to emotional triggers. Essentially, every night, your brain is training you to respond more strongly to the impulses you're consciously trying to suppress. It's a form of perfect neurological sabotage. You spend your day trying to build new patterns, and you spend your night having those patterns systematically undermined by your own limbic system. Huberman describes this as an evolutionary protection mechanism that spun out of control. In ancestral environments, completely ignoring your basic impulses could be fatal. If you suppressed your fight or flight instinct too much, you died. If you completely ignored social or reproductive needs, your genes didn't get passed on. So the brain developed this backup system. Even if you consciously try to suppress certain impulses during the day, the brain makes sure they get reinforced and strengthened during the night. not to destroy you, but to ensure you don't completely disconnect from fundamental survival systems. But here's the problem. You don't live in an ancestral environment anymore. The impulses your brain is reinforcing every night may have been useful 10,000 years ago, but now they're actively sabotaging your life. That anger you control at work, it's being consolidated and strengthened during REM sleep. That envy you feel, but never express. Your brain is creating deeper neural connections, linking it to social triggers. That addiction you're trying to kick? Every night, your limbic system is reinforcing the neural pathways that make it harder to resist. Jung called this confronting the shadow, and he insisted it was the most important and dangerous work of individuation. Because it's not about eliminating these impulses. Trying to eliminate them only makes your brain strengthen them even more during sleep. It's a perfect vicious cycle. The more you repress during the day, the more your brain reinforces during the night, which makes you repress more strongly the next day, which leads to even more intense reinforcement the following night. Huberman's research revealed something even more specific. Timing matters. Most of this shadow reinforcement process happens in the last 2 hours of the REM phase. Typically between 4 and 6 in the morning, for most people, that's when the amygdala has its greatest activity, when the prefrontal cortex is most deactivated, and when the brain has free access to consolidate patterns without conscious executive interference. And here's the most disturbing data point from the study. People who chronically wake up during this period, whether by alarms or insomnia, show significantly altered patterns of emotional processing. They have less shadow consolidation, but paradoxically, they have more difficulty with emotional regulation during the day. This validates something that Jung observed, but couldn't explain. You can't simply avoid or interrupt the work of the shadow. Trying to do so creates worse problems. The shadow needs to be integrated, not eliminated or ignored. And neuroscience is now showing us why. These deep limbic patterns are fundamental to healthy brain function. When you interrupt the process, you don't eliminate the dark impulses, you just create dysregulation in the system as a whole. So what did Jung propose? Something radically different from what any modern optimization protocol suggests. He proposed conscious confrontation with the shadow, not repression, not elimination, but conscious recognition, deliberate exploration, and careful integration. He developed specific techniques to make conscious what was being processed unconsciously. And now, neuroscience is starting to validate those techniques, showing that they fundamentally alter the consolidation patterns during sleep. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Neuroscience used Jung's active imagination protocol, adapted for modern neuroimaging. Participants spent 20 minutes before sleep in a state of relaxed awareness, allowing thoughts and images to emerge freely, without judgment or suppression. What the researchers observed was extraordinary. In the days following these sessions, the activation patterns in the amygdala during REM sleep shifted significantly. There was still processing of repressed emotional content, but now there was simultaneous activation of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The brain wasn't just consolidating dark impulses, it was integrating them with executive awareness. This is exactly what Jung described as individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, but he didn't have the technology to prove the mechanism. Now we do. And the mechanism is fascinating. When you consciously acknowledge and explore shadow content before sleep, you don't eliminate nighttime limbic processing. You change its nature. Instead of blind consolidation of repressed patterns, You get supervised neural integration. Your ventromedial prefrontal cortex remains partially active during processing, creating new connections between limbic impulses and executive control. Huberman describes this as directed neuroplasticity during sleep. Instead of letting your limbic system operate unsupervised during the night, blindly consolidating everything you repressed during the day, you're creating conditions for higher cortical processes to participate in the consolidation. The result isn't elimination of dark impulses, but neural integration of them, with conscious decision-making structures. But here's where most people fail. They treat this as just another optimization protocol. They do active imagination as if it's just another biohacking hack. 15 minutes before bed, check the box. Move on. Jung specifically warned against this. He said, confrontation with the shadow isn't a technique you apply. It's a stance you adopt toward yourself. It's a fundamental willingness to stop warring against parts of yourself and start exploring them with genuine curiosity. Neuroscience validates this powerfully. High-resolution functional MRI studies show that the intention with which you approach shadow exploration practices radically alters their effectiveness. When participants approach active imagination with an attitude of elimination, trying to get rid of unwanted impulses, the brain activation patterns show increased activity in the amygdala and decreased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. They're literally reinforcing the patterns they want to change. But when they approach it with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand instead of eliminate, the patterns are completely different. There's simultaneous activation of limbic and cortical structures, exactly the neural signature of integration. Jung spent decades developing specific methods for cultivating this stance of genuine curiosity toward the shadow. And the beauty of these methods is that they don't require technology, labs, or special equipment. They require only a willingness to look honestly at parts of yourself that you've preferred to ignore. But that simplicity is deceptive. It's one of the most difficult psychological tasks there is. And Jung repeatedly warned that it should be done with care, preferably with guidance. Huberman's research adds a crucial modern layer to this. He's identified specific biological markers that indicate when you're doing shadow integration work effectively versus when you're just reinforcing repression. The first marker is heart rate variability during sleep. When you're actively repressing emotional content during the day, your heart rate variability during REM sleep decreases significantly. Your autonomic nervous system is in a state of hypervigilance, even during sleep. But when you begin genuine shadow integration work, the variability increases, indicating that your nervous system is more relaxed during the processing of emotionally charged material. The second marker is the quality of your morning wake-up. Jung observed clinically that patients doing genuine shadow work often reported more vivid dreams and wake-ups with a sense of meaning. Even when the dream content was disturbing, Huberman found the neural correlation. Effective shadow integration correlates with increased activation of the medial prefrontal cortex upon waking, the region associated with autobiographical reflection and meaning-making. You literally wake up with a greater capacity to make sense of complex emotional experiences. But here's the question most people ask. If shadow integration is so important, why doesn't Huberman talk about it openly? Why all the focus on dopamine protocols, sunlight, exercise, and sleep, but almost no mention of deep psychological work? The answer is complex and reveals a lot about modern scientific culture and its limitations. First, there's the issue of measurability. Dopamine can be measured, light exposure can be quantified, sleep patterns can be tracked, but shadow integration, it's a subjective process, highly individual, that resists simple quantification. Modern science loves things that can be measured, controlled, and replicated. Jungian shadow work is all those things, but in ways that don't fit neatly into standardized experimental protocols. Second, there's the issue of perceived risk. Sunlight and dopamine protocols are relatively safe for people to apply on their own. Shadow work can trigger intense psychological material that some people aren't prepared to handle. Jung was very clear about this. Confrontation with the shadow can be destabilizing, especially if done precipitously or without adequate support. Huberman, as a responsible scientist, probably recognizes that public recommendations about shadow work could have unpredictable consequences for some listeners. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there's a cultural and philosophical issue. The modern optimization culture is built on a fundamental premise that you can and should become an improved version of yourself by eliminating weaknesses and maximizing strengths. It's a fundamentally antagonistic philosophy toward parts of yourself that you consider problematic. Shadow integration starts from a completely different premise. You become more whole, not by eliminating problematic parts, but by consciously integrating them. It's not optimization, it's individuation. And these are fundamentally different views of human development. The tragedy is, without shadow integration, all optimization protocols have a ceiling on their effectiveness. You can optimize your dopamine perfectly, but if you're at war with fundamental parts of yourself, your brain will sabotage your efforts every night. You can have the perfect sleep protocol, but if you're using repression as your primary strategy for dealing with difficult emotions, your sleep will become the battlefield where that war is waged. Jung saw this repeatedly in his clinical practice. Patients who became masters of conscious control, of willpower, of rigorous discipline, and then, inexplicably, they would sabotage everything, drink after years of sobriety, destroy relationships they built carefully, make decisions that contradicted completely everything they said they wanted, not because they were weak or lacked discipline, but because the unintegrated shadow always finds a way to express itself, and the more you repress it consciously, the more explosive the eventual manifestation. Modern neuroscience calls this ego depletion, the idea that willpower is a finite resource that gets exhausted, but that's only half the story. The other half is, the more you use willpower to repress dark impulses during the day, the more your brain works to consolidate them and strengthen them. During the night, you're not just depleting willpower, you're actively creating stronger neural opposition against which you'll need to use willpower tomorrow. It's a cycle that can't be beaten through more optimization. It can only be transformed through integration. And integration isn't a 20-minute protocol. It's a fundamental reorientation of how you relate to yourself. Jung compared the shadow to countries that spend decades in civil war, destroying each other in internal conflict. The solution isn't one side winning completely. It's a process of peace, reconciliation, and integration, where both sides recognize that they are part of the same nation. Huberman provides powerful neuroscientific tools, dopamine control, light protocols, sleep optimization. But these tools work best when they're not used as weapons in a war against yourself, when they're used within a context of individuation, of becoming whole, instead of simply optimized. Jung provides the map for that territory. And the synthesis of the two modern neuroscientific protocols, applied within a Jungian framework of individuation, is where real transformation becomes possible. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. I knew someone, let's call him Jake, who was the definition of perfect optimization. He had all of Huberman's protocols memorized and implemented. Woke up at 5 a.m., 10 minutes of sun exposure, Wim Hof breathing session, black coffee, no carbs until noon, high-intensity workout, cold plunge, precise supplementation, red light at night, in a dark room by 10. His biomarkers were perfect: optimized testosterone, controlled cortisol, sleep tracked and optimized. He was a machine of biological efficiency. And then, at 38 years old, he had a complete collapse. It wasn't gradual. It was sudden and devastating. He started drinking for the first time in 10 years, destroyed his marriage with an affair that he himself described as completely irrational, quit the job he had built for a decade. In 6 months, the entire carefully optimized structure of his life crumbled. When he finally sought help and started Jungian therapy, what emerged was revealing. All that optimization was control, and all that control was a war against parts of himself that he considered unacceptable, anger that he never allowed himself to feel, emotional pain from a difficult childhood that he had buried under layers of discipline, desires and needs that didn't fit the perfect image he was building. For years, he had used optimization protocol as weapons in a psychological civil war. And for years, every night while he slept, his brain was consolidating and strengthening exactly the patterns he most tried to suppress. The collapse wasn't weakness, it was the nervous system finally saying no. It was the shadow, repressed and strengthened night after night, finally finding expression in the only way that remained: explosively, destructively, undeniably. And here's what's fascinating: the biomarkers he had optimized so carefully, they were masking signs of deep psychological dysregulation. His heart rate variability, when finally measured properly during sleep, was chronically low. His brain activation patterns during REM sleep showed exactly what Huberman's studies identified: intensified consolidation of repressed material without cortical integration. What saved him wasn't more optimization, it was the opposite. It was starting the slow, difficult, and non-quantifiable work of shadow integration. It was stopping the war against himself and starting a process of internal peace. And here's what's crucial: Huberman's protocols weren't abandoned, they were recontextualized. The same sun exposure, the same exercise, the same sleep practices, but now, not as weapons of control, but as support tools within a larger process of becoming whole. And when measured again, after months of integration work, his markers changed dramatically, not because the protocols changed, but because his relationship with himself changed. His heart rate variability during sleep increased. His brain activation patterns showed increased cortical limbic integration. He was sleeping fewer hours, but waking up more rested. And more importantly, he stopped sabotaging himself. The destructive impulses didn't disappear, but they stopped controlling his behavior in unconscious ways. That's the power of the Jung-Huberman synthesis. It's not Jung or Huberman, it's Jung and Huberman. Deep psychology, informing modern biology, neuroscience, validating and refining ancient wisdom. And the result isn't perfection, it's wholeness. And wholeness is infinitely more sustainable than optimized perfection built on repression, So let me give you the concrete hybrid protocol, the practical synthesis of Jung and Huberman that emerges from this understanding. But before I do that, I need you to understand that this isn't just another hack. It's not something you do for 4 weeks and then forget. It's a life protocol, a continuous practice of integration. And unlike purely biological protocols, this requires honesty with yourself that most people aren't ready to face. Huberman lays out a protocol, a daily protocol, consisting of 3 distinct phases, each aligning with distinct neurological states. And here's where Jung's wisdom intertwines flawlessly with Huberman's science. Phase 1, morning, from 5 to 9 a.m. Huberman emphasizes that the initial hours after waking are paramount for calibrating your circadian rhythm and optimizing cortisol levels. Sunlight exposure within the first 30 minutes, exercise to capitalize on the natural cortisol peak, and steering clear of caffeine for the first hour. All of that remains. But Jung adds a profound layer. The initial 20 minutes post-awakening represent a period of heightened accessibility to unconscious material processed overnight. So, before diving into optimization strategies, dedicate 10 minutes to journaling, recording any fragments of dreams, sensations experienced upon waking, thoughts, or images that surface before the conscious mind fully takes over. You're not analyzing. You're not judging, you're simply recording. Jung termed this capturing the unconscious material before it's filtered by consciousness, and neurologically, it makes perfect sense. Your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive control and social filtering, requires roughly 30 minutes to achieve full activation after waking. These initial minutes offer a window where normally repressed material can emerge with less resistance. Capturing this raw data provides valuable insights for later integration work. Then you proceed with Huberman's light exposure protocol, but with a subtle yet significant shift. Instead of performing it mechanically, simply checking boxes, approach it with mindful awareness of your internal state. How does your body respond to the light? What emotions surface during exercise? Are you employing discipline as a form of control or as a means of support? It's the same physical action, but the quality of awareness is entirely different. You're cultivating divided attention, part of you executing the protocol, part of you observing your relationship with the protocol. Phase 2. Afternoon to noon to 6 p.m. This window represents peak cortical activity, when your prefrontal cortex is functioning at its highest capacity. Huberman focuses on optimizing deep work, managing dopamine levels, and strategic caffeine timing, all of which remains valid. But Jung adds this is the ideal window for conscious engagement with shadow material captured in the morning, not during productive work, but in a dedicated 30-minute session, ideally between 3 and 5 p.m., when a natural energy dip occurs. Revisit what you recorded that morning. Look for patterns. Ask questions. What impulses did I notice? What emotions did I try to avoid? Where did I sense tension between what I consciously want and what I unconsciously feel? And then comes the crucial part, active imagination. Select an image, sensation, or impulse that surfaced and allow it to unfold freely in your imagination without conscious direction. Simply observe what emerges. Jung described this as giving voice to the unconscious. Neurologically, you're creating simultaneous activation of limbic structures, allowing emotional material to surface, and cortical structures, maintaining observant awareness. This isn't easy. Genuine shadow material is always uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't danger. It's information, and the regular practice of sitting with that discomfort, of creating space for it without acting upon it or repressing it, is what fosters neural integration. You're literally training your prefrontal cortex to remain online while processing intense limbic material. It's directed neuroplasticity, but applied to the most important work, becoming whole. Following this session, you return to Huberman's protocols, but again, the quality has shifted. You're no longer using work and productivity to avoid difficult emotional content. You've already given space to that content. Now, you can work from a place of greater wholeness. Phase 3, evening 7 to 10 p.m. Huberman is clear, dim the lights. Avoid blue light exposure, lower the temperature, create an environment conducive to melatonin production, and he adds, consider specific supplementation, magnesium threonate, apigenin, perhaps even L-theanine, all valid. Jung adds the final component. The last 20 minutes before sleep are critical for establishing the quality of the upcoming nighttime processing. Instead of scrolling through social media or consuming stimulating content, engage in a conscious review of the day. Not judgment, not heavy analysis, just gentle observation. Where did I repress emotions today? Where did I act one way but feel another? Where did I force behaviors? And then, crucially, you don't try to fix anything. You simply acknowledge. Say, aloud if possible, I acknowledge that I felt anger and didn't express it. I acknowledge that I feigned interest when I was bored. I acknowledge the impulse that I suppressed. This conscious recognition before sleep fundamentally alters nighttime processing. Remember the studies I mentioned? When you consciously acknowledge shadow content before sleep, your prefrontal cortex remains partially active during limbic processing. Instead of blind consolidation of repressed patterns, you get supervised neural integration. You still process the material, but now with the participation of higher-level awareness structures. And then you sleep, with all of Huberman's sleep optimization protocols implemented. But now, instead of using optimized sleep to consolidate repression, you're using optimized sleep to facilitate integration. Same protocols, completely different results. This hybrid protocol isn't easy. It requires discipline. Yes, but a different kind of discipline, not the discipline of control and suppression. The discipline of presence and honesty, and the results aren't immediate. You won't experience radical transformation in the first week, but if you maintain the practice, what begins to happen is profound. You stop sabotaging yourself in unconscious ways. Those destructive patterns that seem beyond your control begin to diminish, not because you're controlling them better, but because you've stopped being at war with them. You've integrated them. They haven't disappeared, but now you have awareness of them, and awareness creates choice. Your biological markers improve, but in ways that go beyond what pure optimization can achieve. Your heart rate variability increases. Your sleep becomes more restorative, even if you sleep fewer hours. Your nervous system becomes more resilient because it's no longer expending massive energy in internal conflict. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to feel more whole. Less fragmented, less as though you're constantly holding back parts of yourself. There's a sense of internal congruence that no purely biological protocol can create, because you're no longer using optimization as an escape from yourself. You're leveraging all of this to become more yourself. And you've just stumbled upon something that very few people truly grasp: the profound connection between Jung's shadow and Huberman's modern neuroscience. This revelation has taken years of research to compile, bridging studies that academia deliberately keeps separate. Each video like this one represents dozens of hours diving into scientific papers, Jungian works, and careful synthesis. If this revelation has hit you hard, if seeing the Jung-Huberman connection has shifted something in how you understand yourself, consider using the Super Thanks feature. It's not just financial support. It's you saying, keep revealing what academia hides. Keep building bridges between deep psychology and modern neuroscience. When you click that golden heart below the video, you directly fund the next revelation, the next connection that no one else is making. You're not a passive viewer, you're a truth seeker. And every super thanks is a vote to ensure this work continues, so that more people discover that optimization without integration is just a cycle of self-sabotage dressed up as progress. Now comes the final part, the most important part. What's really at stake here isn't just your efficiency or your biomarkers. It's something much bigger. It's the question of who you're going to become. Are you going to become an optimized but fragmented machine in perpetual war with yourself? Or are you going to become a whole human being, aware of both your strengths and your shadows, capable of using both in an integrated way? Jung used to say that the greatest danger of modernity isn't technology or war. It's the fragmentation of the human psyche. It's the creation of people who are efficient but empty, productive but alienated from themselves, optimized but deeply unhappy. And he said this back in the 1930s, decades before the modern culture of extreme optimization. If Jung could see today's culture of biohacking and optimization, he'd recognize it immediately. It's the same pattern, just with more sophisticated tools. War against the shadow, disguised as self-improvement. And he'd warn you, just like he warned his contemporaries, you can't win a war against yourself. You can only make peace. And that peace, that integration, is the most important work you'll ever do in your life. Not because it makes you perfect, but because it makes you whole. And wholeness is the foundation for everything else that matters. Genuine relationships, meaningful work, the ability to face suffering without falling apart, the capacity to experience joy without fearing its loss. Huberman's protocols are powerful tools. Use them, but use them within a larger framework of individuation. Use them to support the work of becoming whole, not as substitutes for that work. And remember, every night, while you sleep, your brain is working. The question isn't whether that work will happen, it's whether it will happen blindly, consolidating repression, or consciously facilitating integration. You have more power over that process than you realize, but that power doesn't come from more control. It comes from less war. It comes from recognizing that the shadow isn't your enemy. It's a part of you that's been exiled and is trying to come home. And the job isn't to keep the doors locked with increasingly strict discipline. It's to open the doors consciously, on your own terms, and invite the shadow in for integration. When you do that, something extraordinary happens. You stop spending energy on internal civil war and all that energy that was going into repression and control. Now it's available for creation, connection, presence. You become not just more functional, but more alive. So here's my final question. Have you ever noticed your shadow sabotaging you in specific ways? What patterns do you notice that seem to happen automatically against your conscious intentions? Share them in the comments, not necessarily to solve them, but to recognize them, because conscious recognition is the first step to integration. And when you recognize in public, you create space for others to recognize too. And collective recognition is how movements of transformation begin. If you've made it this far, you're part of a minority. Most people give up halfway through, go back to simple protocols that promise results without internal confrontation. But you stayed. You looked at the shadow, and that's already integration beginning. Continue this work, use the protocols, do the inner work, and become not optimized, but whole.